men just need to do better. So that's the line, and I'm just looking for your reaction on it.
My initial reaction is laughter. Sorry, I don't mean to make light of it.
Hi, I'm Andy,
And I'm Roger,
and welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics.
on our search to find the middle.
We're going to give you last week's news today.
That's a slogan we should put on a t-shirt.
Stop touching her!
I am tonight announcing my candidacy.
Taylor Swift. Look, my biggest issue with marriage is that I think that it's a fundamentally flawed institution that is built on the oppression of women.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny.
Having truly rational conversations about controversial issues is risky these days.
Roger.
Andy, how you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. Got a question to ask you.
Shoot.
I was listening to the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast by Josh Szeps, and a mysterious guest appeared. Sounded remarkably like you.
Lots of people sound like me, Andy. No, Szeps and I go way back, and when I got the call, I just couldn't let him down. I had to appear on the show.
So tell us about what happened, how it came about.
So we're actually both listeners of Uncomfortable Conversations with Josh Szeps, and I think that part of the reason why we like the show is that his project or his aim is very similar to ours in the middle, right? We're trying to take the trickiest parts of a conversation and have a good faith conversation, right? So he had a session recently that was aired, I believe, recorded and aired on the same day. That's production for you. And it was pitched as a Ask Me Anything. And so I put in with a few questions to be selected. And yeah, we had a good conversation and ended up being his very first talkback, Josh Opens Up the Phones episode.
But let's be honest, it wasn't really quite like that. It was like the Josh and Roger show, right? It was like 15 minutes in, he was still having a yarn to you, right?
Well, when you... Well, I don't know if that reflects poorly on me, but yeah. I think
you hogged the party.
Yeah, had to. Look, so the question that I chose to ask was in regards to, everything that's going on in Australia about violence towards women and the crisis that we are having right now. So there are demonstrations, there's been a spate of issues, there's all sorts of statistics that we will get into. And my question to Josh initially was, without any of my commentary to colour things, what does he think of the phrase that's been used in placards, in demonstrations, on the media, by men, by women, everywhere, saying, men just need to do better? And that's what I threw to him as a question.
Okay, so I think just for our listeners, we should insert here a package of some of the highlights from your appearance, and then we can come back to it.
Josh, I wanted to gather your reaction to a line that I've been hearing in regards to violence against women in Australia.
Fabulous.
And the line is, the phrase that you see on placards and in the media is that men just need to do better. So that's the line, and I'm just looking for your reaction on it.
My initial reaction is laughter. Sorry, I don't mean to make light of it. There's currently a national conversation going on in Australia about domestic violence. Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, I'm inclined to ask you what your thoughts are. Is there a take buried in that innocuous question?
I mean, it is. If I'm going to be honest and a bit flippant about it, now that I've heard that line that I just need to do better, I won't go home and murder my family and children and commit suicide.
Yeah, it's good. I'm glad that we've had that clarified for us. Yeah, because I wasn't aware. It reminds me a little bit of like some neighbourhoods in Sydney, many of which are the most multicultural and least racist neighbourhoods in the world, have seen fit to use taxpayer funds to erect signs on the street signs saying racism not welcome here, as if racists are wandering around going, oh, if racism is not welcome, then maybe I shouldn't be racist. Domestic violence is a huge problem. Every 4 days, a woman is killed by someone she knows. One death is too many. Yet, like you, I do feel like you sort of want to win over the largest number of winnable people, don't you? So, I mean, you want the bulk of men to feel like they're not being looped in with pathological maniacs who commit violence against women. I understand the instinct to get men talking to other men in ways that are more constructive and making domestic violence taboo, and that was probably a laudable goal in 1985. How many communities in 2024 of men are actually sitting around going, oh, just give her a bit of a slap about the face. She'll be all right. I don't know any men who speak that way. Maybe I'm like detached and ivory tower, but I think we've all basically got the memo. I mean, it's sort of obvious, isn't it? Why don't you just say that murderers need to do better? Murderers need to not murder, unlike domestic violence.
I think that's the problem, Josh. So, like, to your point, it paints this picture to people that men are on this sliding scale or spectrum from civilized man to somewhere between aggressive abuser and, at worst, the Bondi stabber, right? And I think it's this idea that we're all on this spectrum as men and we're all white knuckling through this world not to hurt people. And I think that's the dangerous message I feel that it sets up, right? I know it's not always at that space and I support many things, but the people that really need to hear this message aren't going to be the ones that will listen to it, because there are other systemic things going on. There are mental conditions that need to be sorted out. There's trauma. And so I think it's a little bit misguided and you end up alienating a lot of your would-be advocates.
Yeah, and yes, that's right. And that can also lead to more pernicious and toxic versions of masculinity coming to the fore.
It's the problem with hearts and minds, isn't it, Josh, that you need this raw emotion to get people off their seat, to capture them, for the media to even pick things up. But the problem is when that anger and that frustration just attaches to the wrong thing.
So, Roger, why that question? What prompted you to ask that?
Well, I think that what I've seen over, pretty much the last 6 months of the news cycle is this format where there's a very serious issue underneath, but the way that it's presented and the way that the public is engaged is very emotional, very clickbaity almost, but personified in the public, in the kind of way that we talk about these things, the rhetoric. And I think that this is another example that I wanted to call out, where there's a serious issue of domestic violence underneath all of this, but the slogans trying to label and blame a group rather than deal with the complexities of the issue is really the enemy here, and I think that we saw very similar things in a lot of movements around Black Lives Matter and different slogans on other sides and all sorts of things. So to me, it represented a way to really ask someone like Josh Szeps, who deals with this for a living, what he thought about it and whether it would, and I honestly didn't know, right, whether it would trigger his kind of moderate side to say what he thought was meant and in a very kind of positive or generous way, or whether he would feel similar to how I'm feeling. So that's why I asked the question.
So I think just to give a little bit of background and context for anyone listening that isn't really sure of why this is a contemporary question to ask, there were some rallies over the past week or two. There has been, quite I don't know what the adjective is to describe it, but there was an incident where a partner murdered a mother. I think it was an ex-partner. He was charged for committing a violent act or something. I'm not 100% across the details, but he was actually let out on bail. So rather than protecting her from him, given the very real risk that he could commit further violence against her, they let him out on bail, and he on bail went and murdered her. Right. So I mean that's horrible, right? And I don't think anyone would react any differently other than that, to sort of acknowledge it as that. And of course that translates then into the subsequent debate about, well, how do we deal with these situations? It puts a spotlight on domestic violence. It raises questions around what's the right policy response to when something like that happens. Like, we've got to go and have a look at how we approach these things. We have calls for Royal Commission into domestic violence and all of this. And I'm not actually sure if the two are necessarily related, as in whether this march was, pre-planned or it just happened to coincide with some of these, with that particular recent case. But nonetheless, there was a sort of national rally organised by a not-for-profit and, all around Australia. Not just women. It wasn't like a women's march. It was like just people who were, I don't know if protesting is the right word, but who wanted to, make a statement that they feel like we need to do something more robust to deal with violence against women. So That's kind of the context, and I think that does tend to bring out a whole diversity of perspectives, ranging from maybe the more nuanced positions right up to some of the more maybe less considered or more reactionary responses.
Yeah, and it's that end of the scale that I'm offering up to this discussion to have a bit of a review, right? And in the most flippant version of it, it's someone saying something to the tune of, "This is not complex, guys. Men, just stop killing your partners," right? And I've heard a version of that in different ways, and I'm not discounting that there are more nuanced ways of saying it that are out there in the media. But there is that floating around, and my question was to kind of understand the utility. Like anything to do with social change or movement or some kind of march to get a protest, you have to think of it as a campaign, right? And when you throw out misguided statements like this, you're essentially shooting yourself in the foot. I mean, what are your thoughts with it?
So can we get a couple of things off the table first, right? So we're going to talk about this topic in the way that we approach topics here on The Middle, which is we're going to explore both sides, and not necessarily that there are two sides here we've got to explore, but like we're not just, I mean, the easiest thing we could do is like, let's take the talking points, right? And just spout them off about how, oh yes, it's like terrible. It's, there's no complexity to this. It's just, as you said, men must do better and all this sort of stuff, right? That would be the easiest thing in the world for us to do, right? Especially as two men, right? So if we can get off the table just to begin with that we're approaching this in like good faith, like we're not like men's rights activists or anything like that, trying to, challenge any notion that, women's rights, how dare they like trample men's freedom to do what, that's not where we're coming from. I think we're just trying to explore this, right, a little, in a more nuanced way for what it actually is, and inject some of the actual complexity that exists. So on that note, I just want to like touch on the spectrum that we've got, right? We've got a diversity of perspectives, and I think there is like a very serious, sensible conversation, and there's, the part of this movement that I think is talking about very nuanced sort of suggestions, right? They're talking about things like funding for shelters for women, like when they need like crisis accommodation and things like that. There's, talking about funding, there's talking about, the media not, displaying kind of names and faces of victims within 48 hours, stuff like that, right? Which is like that's like the serious part of this conversation, which absolutely, we should engage in as like community to talk about, right? But I do want to, like, I just think there's something about any kind of protest or any kind of like activism that it just takes all of the nuance away, and it just dumbs down an issue to such like a ridiculous kind of pithy, like whatever you can fit on like a signboard at a protest, right? As though you can synthesize a whole issue to pithy statements like, and I'm going to read you a list of statements that I've seen on posters at these marches, and I'm just going to read them out. And this is like the synthesis of the problem according to some of the protesters. Okay, so first of all, a sign with the word "not" scribbled out, all men, so not all men, with "not" scribbled out, and yes, all men. A sign with "boys will be boys," with boys crossed out and instead held accountable. So boys will be held accountable. Number 3, this is a crisis, act like it. Number 4, protect your daughters, with that's crossed out, and instead replacing it with educate your sons. Mm-hmm. And the last one, get off your bum, stop violence against women. So there's a few in there, and most of them, well, some of the ones I've picked out have kind of, touched on this, something you said earlier around like, oh, it's let's look at the whole group of like men and boys, right? They're as a totality, like they're responsible for this, right? So we've got to educate them. We've got to, hold them responsible, right? As a collective.
Yeah.
But the second group is like, like this is a crisis, act like it, or get off your bum, stop violence against women. like, to me, just, it's such a simplistic statement, right? It's like as though there's some button that needs to be pressed and someone hasn't pressed it, right? Like someone hasn't turned the off button off, you know, as though that's all it takes, as opposed to, you know, kind of recognizing that this is all very, very complicated.
It's a tough list, and you know, I've seen quite a few others as well. You know, the whole silence is violence, and all these different things, right? And it's hard not to come away from that with this kind of comprehension that there is something inherently wrong about the male form, right? Because of the way it's been reduced into a sign, and like you said, sucked all the nuance out of it, right? And not only men, but like boys, right? And look, I think this discussion and the sensitivity around it has lots of echoes of other things that we've talked about. And when I want to put myself on the shoe on the other foot, I suppose, I'm going to go back to the way that we approach the whole white privilege thing, right? Because when we spoke about white privilege, it often was adjacent to male privilege. It's just like, you know, you were saying, well, take out our race and then swap it for male privilege, and you're back on my side again. And I think the charge that's laid on this discourse is that if I tell you something as the other side, right, as women telling men, or telling the public rather, that negative things are happening to me, right, like women are dying, the first thing out of your mouth better not be something that is defensive. So let's get that out of the way. Let's get that thing out of the way, right? So it doesn't look like the very first thing our instinct is to say that. All the statistics, you know, and I'm speaking for probably both of us now, we agree that, like Josh Szeps said on the episode, one death is too many when it comes to male violence against women. There are issues here that need to be improved. You know, this idea that women have an extra mental load when it comes to their safety, that's real, right? And I think that we're acknowledging all of those things. And I think that has to be said at the start, right? So put a line under that. We acknowledge that this is about understanding how, if you have a problem, what are you going to do about it? Like, how are we going to kind of come together as a society to solve it? Because like you said, there's no simple silver bullet here. It's definitely not, this is not complex. Men, you just need to stop killing and raping people, which literally is some of the lines that you hear, right? Now, I also acknowledge that it's tough because when you need to affect change, you need emotion, you need drama, you need theatrics, right? You need a certain level of animosity and anger for the media to pick it up, for people to get off their bums and even listen, for you know, you and I to talk about this. It needs that. So that's part of the dance, right? That's you almost need to go over the top with that so that people will listen. But then it's what you do with that attention afterwards that I'm also interested in.
I don't think there's really any strategy. I just think like where sometimes there's like a bit of a hive mind kind of thing going on where we all like to collectively feel things at the same time, right? So and we see these things ebb and flow, right? You know, for example, why at a particular point in time did the murder of George Floyd in the United States spark the Black Lives Matter movement? Why that particular case of police brutality against a black person? Why was that the thing that, you know, because the whole thing of the Black Lives Matter movement is that this happens, you know, a dime a dozen, unfortunately. And I think these things do tend to, why the Me Too movement? Why at that time? And so these things tend to get, like, I think there's, you know, we kind of like enjoy collectively feeling these things, right? And I think we're at one of those moments here in Australia in terms of violence against women, saying, no, this is enough, right? And that's what kind of triggers people to get out there on the streets and to make public statements, get on social media and show their solidarity for the movement and so on. And, you know, like you don't necessarily, to your point earlier, you're not really welcome. Like if you're going to be the party pooper who comes and says, well, actually, technically, the rate of violence against women per 1,000 population is, you know, insert stat here, right? Like
yeah.
that's not what people want, right? At that moment, they want people to acknowledge, they want people to listen, and they want to feel heard, right? And they don't feel heard if dudes come and react with like, well, no, hang on, what about our rights? You know, I'm not violent. You know, like this defensive view. So that's kind of what I think you were saying before in terms of, you know, that's not what people want to hear, right? But at the same time, there comes a time when these things have to or should be grounded in facts and figures, particularly when we transition into like a policy response phase. I had a curiosity because like some of those quotes that, you know, from the placards that I mentioned before are things like, you know, this is a crisis, right? This idea that there is a crisis. Now, I think crisis for me tends to suggest that, you know, things are getting worse. But actually, when you look at the rate of violence, it's actually falling, right? So to give some actual numbers, so in 1990-91, there were 1.12 domestic homicides, like as in a sexual partner relationship situation of women. So 1.12 homicides of women per 100,000 population. That was in 1990-91. And in 22-23, that's dropped to 0.32. So it's gone from 1.12 per 100,000 population to 0.32 per 100,000 population. So I think if we are going to talk about solutions, and 0.32 is too high, and let's make no mistake about that, but if we are going to talk about what do we do to get better, I think we could do well to look at, well, what are the factors that explain the trajectory that has been in the right direction over the past 30 years, which has seen it essentially, it's less than a third of what it was. So, and look, I think like it's almost taboo to even say that there's stats showing that things are getting better, right? But I think the risk is if we don't lay some foundations like that, you know, the tricky thing is like, how do you discuss these sorts of facts without, you know, on the other hand, being seen to sort of undermine or cheat or lessen the experiences of people who've actually been impacted?
Part of the issue with this is probably starting with definitions and the statistics, right? And I'm not going to kind of try to tear it all apart, but I think that, you know, what women would say is that violence towards women as it currently stands is not just talking about domestic violence and deaths and things like that. It's now spread to a much wider gender issue around any kind of male aggression or control, coercion towards women, right? And I think that I've seen that a lot in response to the episode that we recorded, but also in general comments online, that if you are just focusing on how many times, you know, a woman has been killed at the hands of a man, that's the wrong way to look at it. It's actually every time a man traps a woman or coerces them or treats them poorly or exercises their advantage over them in any kind of way. And so that's the kind of landscape we're working with. It's like a very multifaceted, it's really pushing at the boundaries of the relationships between the sexes as well, right?
Yeah, and look, I think just to be clear, you know, the reason I think there's a focus on like homicides, right, in a domestic partner sort of, that's how the data is collected, is not because, you know, that's the only form of violence we care about and that every other form of violence is okay. Maybe 50 years ago, if you said violence against women, you know, and we were two middle-aged blokes having a conversation about it, we'd probably be thinking, oh, yeah, that's beating up your wife, isn't it? Like, that's what we mean, right? Violence against women. Whereas now we wouldn't even bat an eyelid if you said, well, it also includes other more subtle things like verbal abuse and maybe also withholding like financial resources, or, you know, there can be other sources of like control and power that's used. And I think we would probably be happy to kind of have a conversation and include that in the definition, right? But that itself is like the outcome of people speaking up and expressing more and more dissatisfaction with the status quo. And I think when women sort of, at the moment, they're getting up and saying, well, this is not acceptable, they're not necessarily saying, oh, it's become more risky for me and I'm more fearful as a woman. They're just saying, well, look, the fact that I am even fearful at all is the problem.
Yeah, I agree. Look, I want to turn now to give the most generous interpretation of the sign, right? The idea that men just need to do better, right? And so, what is hidden in there that you could read in a productive way? And I think if the sentiment is trying to say this is a problem for women, is a problem for society, and in terms of mental real estate occupied by men, the kind of priority list that men have in terms of solving problems of the world, it's not high enough. And I want to do this as a community together, and you need to be in here in the room helping me solve it, then, I think that's okay, right? But, how would you do that? So tell me your most generous interpretation of the phrase.
All right. So the vast majority of violence is men are the perpetrators, 100%. Like, there's no debating that. So in that very narrow dimension of, like, way of cutting the numbers, 100%, that group of men are the problem. And there's not many women in that bucket. And probably the women who've committed violence, there's probably an abusive man behind them that, in a lot of those cases too, right? So I think these statements are provocative, and they're intentionally provocative, right? And I don't think these people who have these placards actually have a view that, like, oh no, like this is literally just like a man problem, and we need to hold the whole of male culture, responsible, and they all need to give us their pound of flesh to repent, right? I don't think that's the sentiment. But I think what the sentiment is behind it is that, well, we need to look at, like, what are the cultural factors that could possibly, like, get us to this point. Now, we spoke earlier around that there has been actually a fall. And you sort of think, well, what are the factors, right? And I do think, like, you can look at, like, things like alcoholism, right? You can say, well, abuse of alcohol probably has changed, right? You can look at women having, like, increasing female participation in the workforce, like that has an effect too, because that increases women's basically autonomy and power. A whole range of other factors that have even, like, there's, like, respect for women is higher than it probably was, like, in the past. You have socioeconomic factors at play too, right? So I think these are all things that are changing, and it does probably show, if you're 100% honest, that culturally, like, there are some things you can do and look at, and they are going to involve men, because that's where they're the perpetrators of violence.
Well, let me be more specific. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to lay out a bit of a framework that I think that, people share in a certain way. And maybe we can discuss or you can react to that framework. And because I think within this, it will draw out some of the main conflicts that people have, and why there's such a dichotomy or such volatility in this discussion, right? So the first one is, like, I want to paint you a landscape of men. Now, I'm going to categorize 3 groups. One is a small percentage of violent perpetrators. Okay, violent male perpetrators that are actively perpetrating violence against women. There's a second, slightly larger cohort of men who are capable or at risk of violence under the right circumstance, under the right kind of conditions that are capable and will, if pushed in certain ways, like the things you've mentioned, drug, alcohol, down in their luck, provocation, or a whole bunch of different things, that they will also be violent. And then you've got the vast majority of men who do not offend. They probably couldn't be ever pushed into a scenario that they would offend and perpetrate violence towards women. So I'm going to paint that picture for you. Now, instantly, I think there are people that wouldn't agree with this, because they see that main cohort of men as malleable to always, their base instinct of aggression and violence towards women. But that's what I'm going to kind of paint here. And just to clarify, and before you go on, and for anyone that I've lost already with this experiment framework, I'm specifically using the word violence, and I mean physical violence towards women. And I'm not talking about coercion, control, financial control, any of those kind of other more mental and long, DV related things that will be separated for this experiment. Now, the second part of conflict is for me is this idea that you can say something, you can send messages, you can rehabilitate this small population of violent offenders through policies, through actions, through all these kind of things. It becomes like a crime and punishment thing. Do you believe in rehabilitation for these people? And how many can you save from that larger cohort of would-be offenders, right? So I think that why I think there's a futility in sometimes these arguments around trying to tell men not to stop killing people is because the people that need to hear that in the small group of violent offenders or would-be violent offenders, they won't listen to that. That's not how the world works. That's not how the pathology works, right? And I think that's the second conflict. And the third conflict, I think, is that there is this expectation, so in built in the phrase of men just need to do better, is that huge cohort, in the majority cohort of civilized men need to be doing more. And I don't believe it's just more in sense of promoting policy change. I think it's like you should be, you should notice, you should get involved. If you see a woman in distress, you should intervene. If there's some kind of violence that you can see, implant yourself, talk to people, do all these kind of things. And I think that is also this idea of where a lot of this goes wrong. So those are the three things in the landscape, the framework that I'm going to lay out, and I'm really up for discussion on what you think I've missed.
Okay, so I like your framework. So let's call them groups A, B, and C. Group A, the violent ones who are just innately violent, always doing violent things. Then Group B being the slightly larger group of the population who could be violent, but they can be saved, sort of thing. And then Group C, men who are not violent and who will not be violent by default, right? So a statement like men should do better, or what are the other variants? Things like yes, all men, and so on.
It's simple. Just stop killing and raping.
Yeah. So really, men must do better. Really, what that sign should read is groups A and B should do better, right? And I guess what I mean by that is, other than that men aren't victims, although to be actually very clear about this, there are more male victims of male violence than there are female victims of male violence. So actually groups A and B causing violence actually tend to be, there are more male victims of male violence committed by groups A and B than there are. Anyway, but that I don't want to necessarily use that to put a pin to burst the balloon sort of thing. But, really what a sign like that should read is groups A and B should do better, right? And I think that the problem and the risk in terms of alienating, potential, and not kind of, every reaction has an equal and opposite reaction. So if signs like that are intended to be a little bit provocative, intended to, get people's attention, the risk is that in doing so, they don't just sort of get attention in a positive way, they risk sort of alienating that third group, Group C, that you kind of talked about, who is actually completely innocent. They're the innocent bystanders to this, right? And just to take your point and just be double down on it that you just said before about other forms of violence, the Group C can be misogynists, they can be coercive control, like there can be other things going on which would meet a definition of violence too. So we don't want to kind of discount that. But I guess in the general sense, like I think that's the risk in framing this kind of a sign, right? Is that, really what we mean is groups A and B need to do better, not, not men, as in groups A, B, and C need to do better. The only thing I would say, just to add to that, is that, when we talk about like weekly and regular abuse of domestic partners, like regular beatings and all that sort of stuff, there's a certain kind of psychotic person who does that, like psychological makeup that leads them to do that. But I do think there's other forms of violence that, maybe they're one-off. Maybe it's like, a husband walks in on his wife sleeping with someone else or something like that, pulls out, a gun that's on the dressing table or something like that. If we had guns more in Australia, this might be a bigger problem, but and shoots the gun and suddenly has done something that they regret. And there's like other versions of that could happen. So, and I think those sorts of things, even though they're not the kind of person who would regularly abuse their partner, they can do things like that. And I think that's in people without them even knowing. And I guess that's possibly a problem with the A, B, and C category, is that you may not know which one you fit in until you're presented with the circumstances.
Yeah. I'm willing to leave a space for crimes of passion, particularly the one that you mentioned, which is the old classic, right? Walking in to find your partner in bed with someone. But would you agree that the conflict that I've outlined is that actually a misinterpretation or disagreement, rather, that's probably the more accurate term, with whether those categories exist?
I don't think it matters in the purest sense, right? Whether that's like a clinical, the DSM, what are they?
Yeah.
The DSM manual, like whether this is like the right way to sort of categorize things. Like, and of course, as humans, we like to simplify things. We like to categorize things in this way. But I don't think whether it's
I'm willing to concede the overlapping bubbles as well. There's like a slight overlap between these groups.
I think the point is it a good enough approximation for reality? And I think it is. So whether it's just a way of thinking about it, like I think it's a good way of thinking about it. That is more or less true of reality, right? But except that the reality that perhaps this model is talking about is not 100% the same as what, the people marching, to stop end violence against women are talking about. I mean, they're talking about things. I actually think that they are talking about misogynists.
Yeah, and I agree. They are, absolutely.
So I don't think, in that sense, like it's as good for the broader conversation about respect for women.
But again, the attitudes, yes, but I do think this idea that misogyny, taking into account the whole socialization of kids, turns people from, group C of civilized men into group B or A, I think is ultimately misguided as well.
I mean, misogyny and violence are not on the same spectrum. Like, they're different spectrums, right? And they might be overlapping, like there might be a correlation even, but they're not the same thing.
I'm glad you raised that. Let's go to a very well-known example. I'm listening at the moment to the Not Now, Not Ever audiobook, so about the famous misogyny speech by Julia Gillard towards Tony Abbott. It's actually incredible how much we've changed in 10 years and what Julia Gillard, the first female Prime Minister of Australia, had to go through. Pretty shocking in terms of what was fair play when jousting with her, especially in a political sense, personal sense too. Now, let's look at a figure like Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott probably embodies a lot of what the public would associate with a total misogynist, right? He's on record having some pretty damning kind of statements. Things around like men maybe have inherently better capabilities for leadership. He was very complicit in some of the sledging of Gillard at the time. And yeah, I just think that he paints that picture, that stereotype of misogyny. But you wouldn't make the leap to your point that is going to tip over into violence against women, right? And I think that you have to separate the two, that one is a different attitude towards the genders and doesn't always necessarily mean aggression towards the genders. Right?
So Waleed Ali wrote in today's Sydney Morning Herald, today being the 3rd of May, actually wrote about this because I can't remember when it was, but in... was it 2015, 16, something like that? There was, a line to the effect of, I think actually former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said something to the effect of, not all disrespect for women leads to violence, but all violence, or something like that, the source of it is disrespect for women or something. And I think what Waleed Ali was sort of saying in his article is that, well, actually, a lack of respect for women is not what's causing this, incidents of violence against women. It's actually more fundamental things like men being, shamed or their status being
eroded.
affected by women, right? Either because they, let's say they have a partner, and it's a lot of the cases.
Is he talking about violence?
Yeah. So it's like a lot of the homicides against women, for example, they're former partners, ex-partners that have committed it, right? So like that's not uncommon, right? Well, when I say it's not uncommon, I mean when you look at homicides, right, that a former partner is involved, right? It's like a revenge thing, right? It's like, oh, you've destroyed my honor, so I have to, like, I'm outraged by this.
Well, that's the whole
right?
thing about cuckolding, right? But does that also, putting our boffin hats on, the male sense of privilege and power has been eroding steadily over time. So it's getting worse and worse and eroded. The rates of violence against women have been declining.
Well, I don't think it's so much in a like macro sense, but rather in a micro sense that the trigger is and like status
it always has been kind of thing.
Yeah, but and don't forget, status is not like, I think, like, I view status, and my mental model for status is it's a relative concept. It's not a absolute concept. So it's not like it's possible to, like, for male status relative to women to be falling, but it's a relative thing, right? It's like relative to your peers, relative to, so there always are going to be people with above average status and people with below average status, almost because it's like where you fit in the dominance hierarchy of society, right? And then I guess it's up to the rest of like culture and society to, you know, the forces of the culture to say that's not what you do, right?
I want to tilt to one more thing before we leave this framework alone, and that's my point on what we believe the civilized middle, Group C, should be doing. Right? What is the call to action for this group? Because I see all things, right? Like I actually see this idea that if you see something, say something and do something, right? Like stand up, man up for women, right? Like what is your view on that?
So I think we have to remember Group C. So just as a reminder, this is the males who are not innately violent, and they're not either they're not regularly violent, and they're not capable. Ordinarily, their default is not to be violent, or they're not capable of being.
Yeah, let's go
violent.
C for civilized men. Let's make it
C for civilized men, right? So I think this is where the conversation turns, and like I think the first thing we have to put on the table is that this Group C, civilized men, whilst they're not the perpetrators, they're also not the victims. So they don't experience that whole like fear and anxiety of like walking down the street, you know, that they're going to get sexually assaulted or something. Like they don't wear those sorts of things. They're not victims of the kind of violence we're here talking about today, which is sexual violence, right? Or domestic violence. So then what do? Well, look, the reality is that Group C, they are in power. You know, they comprise of a majority of our parliaments. They are in the most powerful positions of government, treasurer, prime minister, premiers. They're the lawmakers. So, you know, we might even be talking about in a corporate environment. They tend to be more likely to be the CEOs of an organization. What things are they doing? So they're perhaps less likely to do things that need to be done because they don't experience the fear. They're not victims, so they may overlook. There might be a blind spot. So I think the suggestion of what they should be doing and what needs to happen is they need to understand this is a problem, and they need to be aware of that their potential blind spot. Now, you can have a whole other conversation about, well, to what extent is this a problem? To what extent should, you know, there be solutions? But I think that's what they're saying, right? When they put up the placards saying that, I think what they're saying is that men just don't get it because they don't understand, because they aren't themselves fearful, and they don't experience the reality of what they're talking about.
You've taken a very kind of highfalutin and very practical response to this, which is, you know, the lawmakers, we're talking to the lawmakers, the power, the privilege to leverage this, and actually representation is important, like you said, to have that understanding and put that point of view for women in there. But I personally think, and I'm going to read you a comment. I'm going to read you a comment that appeared directly under the Josh Szeps episode, right, which I think encapsulates a lot of the more localized thought on this issue. And it's this lady, I'm not going to talk about names, but this is in response to the episode. She said, DV isn't just about the murderers. It's about the uncontrolled, angry, and need to control other people. it would be nice if the decent blokes did notice, say or do something, and I had to turn this one off. Josh Szeps replied with, honest question, do you think when decent blokes see other men inflicting uncontrolled anger on a woman, they don't say or do anything? She then replied, in my experience, often, no, they don't. It's, inverted commas, not their business. So I think that there's a lot of people who are literally talking about, Andy, you're out in the town, you see a woman getting harassed. What are you going to do about it? You're going to go over and try to talk to them? You're going to get physically involved? Like, I think that is an element here too.
I mean, it depends what we're talking about too, right? I mean, if you're talking about a couple bickering on public transport and, what one person might see through the lens of like domestic violence and say, oh, well, this is not going to end well when that person gets home. They're in public now, so everything's kind of a bit more moderated, but like, maybe people do view it through as like that kind of situation, right? But like people do stand up to violence, right? You need to look at like the dude with the French dude with the bollards at Westfield Bondi Junction. Like, in fact, people kind of almost in a irresponsible way stand up to violence because probably the smartest thing to do, frankly, if someone's wielding a knife, is to run. Honestly,
Andy, I'm going to give you 3 condensed stories about 3 times in my life that I have intervened when it came to some kind of male-on-female altercation. And you can give me a kind of rating on whether this was the right move going forward. So I'm going to take you all the way back in the day. We're at Hornsby Inn. It's this dodgy kind of dive pub. It's late at night. People are still smoking inside. There was the situation where I was there with a tennis buddy and this group of guys were kind of harassing this group of girls. And it got to the stage where it was clearly like they wanted them to go away. And it got a little bit heated. And one of the guys flicked their cigarette, or ashed it, flicked their cigarette, so the ash flew in the face of one of the girls. And at that point, we intervened and we kind of were like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And we started to kind of have a bit of a tussle with them. And then we all got kicked out and then we all dispersed. So that's the very first one. The second one was in a corporate setting. I was at a particular employer that I no longer work for, and a male employee at the time was in a stairwell with myself and some others. He had an argument with a female employee, and he didn't hit her, but he lunged. He lunged at her. We were all spoken to by the different managers and different people trying to court us and thing before the HR inquiry, and the manager tried to convince some of us not to make a big deal of it. We chose to give an accurate description of the thing, and there were consequences, and that person was fired. And finally, the third one. I was living in an apartment, and quite regularly we would hear some serious, in the middle of the night, from the, like 1 a.m., 2 a.m., some serious domestic fighting going on above us. Yelling, fighting, things being thrown, like hitting sounds. And one day we decided we're being irresponsible. It's very, very hard to intervene because it's like you don't know what's going on, right? It's someone else's relationship. One time we intervened and we knocked on the door and we asked if everything was okay. And in no uncertain terms, we were told to stay the fuck away from them. So those are my 3. What do you think?
Not to use misogynist language, but you've got to be ballsy to do that. And this is maybe the thing that in this sort of context, maybe women don't appreciate is that men are equally fearful of the violent dude, right? And we know more dudes are victims of male violence than women, right? So this is a thing, right? So maybe it can be like there's a cowardly element there, but like even so, when violence is when you hear violence of some description occurring, fight or flight kicks in. It's human instincts, and the easiest thing in the world to do is flight, right?
And there's a bit of an expectation in that whole man up thing, like, it's time to join the fight.
All right, so Roger, today we've talked about probably one of the more sensitive topics that we've covered on the middle, and I think we've discussed like aspects of it. We haven't even touched like the surface of it.
Yeah.
So we haven't even really explored like what the actual solutions are, and there's like a whole wish list of things like extra funding for DV services and crisis care, and beyond the scope of what we've been able to look at tonight. But like in summary, like what do you want to leave our listeners with? Like as we conclude this episode?
Look, I think it's the first part of it is really just to how do we have a conversation about it in a productive way, and I think that you can spend a lot of time trying to get that across the line, and that needs to be balanced with this frustration that we're not doing enough, right? And I totally get that frustration, but I think it needs to be, like you said, tempered in the right kind of process, the right kind of discourse, and what needs to happen to get a positive outcome. So that's where my focus kind of is, to step through this and work this through, and really not to kind of get sucked into the whole media cycle about it, right? Like, how do you have a productive conversation after you've had the emotion and the frustration and the outrage to get everyone's attention? And that's kind of what I'm interested in, and that's why we're not finished. And I guess from a personal perspective, I'm willing to do the work, and I'm, processing material and reading things and doing stuff to actually be an active contributor in this space. I haven't totally zeroed down how I'm going to do that, but yeah, it is. I see that as something that I will kind of take up. So that's, I suppose, where I'm at.
Yeah, and for me, look, I think we're talking about it, right? So we're having a conversation about it. We're dedicating time to talk about this as mates, but obviously with our listeners listening in as well. But this is the middle, right? And the easiest thing we could do would be to just say what the politicians would say in this, which is like buy into all the motherhood statements, like roll out the talking points, and say everything that everyone wants to hear, and we'd have a nothing episode, because this is the middle, and we like to explore different perspectives on topics. So, but we're talking about it. Like, we could have just ignored this and put out like another Taylor Swift episode, right? But we're talking about this topic. We got plenty in the pipeline for anyone who's wondering. No, but we're talking about it. But you can't talk about this, especially as two blokes, and we're very conscious about that, right? We're not like we're giving our perspective on it, right? Which is as two blokes who aren't directly impacted by this stuff, right? Although we do have, we have partners, you have daughters, so it's not 100% like removed, right? So, but we're having a conversation. We're getting into it. We're getting stuck into the ins and outs of it. And if you can't do that in 2024, and increasingly sometimes on some topics you can't, I think that's bad. I don't think it's a good thing. I think if people were to say, no, you can't have this conversation on your terms the way you want to have it, well, you're just going to have a whole bunch of people say, well, fuck it, I'm not going to have a conversation about it at all. I'm just going to play video games instead. So that's how I'm going to leave it. And yeah.
It's true, Andy. I think I was listening to like Mamma Mia a few weeks ago when they had that runner who's killed, and they said that it's our want that all the male podcasters actually start talking about this and start dealing with this topic. So you're right. It's on the list for us, and we're discussing it. We're trying to come to grips with it, and I think that's responding to what's being asked of us, right, in that group. So yeah, let's keep going.
All right. Well, over and out.